Hello, Geoffrey. It's again a real pleasure to have you back, and we are really honored that you keep choosing our little meeting. And that's probably the first question: why Multicore World?
Well, it has excellent participants, and if you look at the number of questions you have, it's far higher than other meetings. So I say that's the reason I come.
Well, that's the ethos of. I organize this little conference and a way that I want conferences to be. You start to talk, and then no one gives you feedback. So what's the point of that? There is YouTube for that.
That's right, I agree.
Now, you made a lot of very interesting comments and massive relationship with industry, but you keep commenting at the end of some of your slides, this should be open source. And I am witnessing, and this is a personal comment, like the hyperscalers, they are becoming factories on its own in terms of research, but not in the way as 30, 40, 50 years ago, like ATT labs or that. Are we witnessing a world where knowledge is totally within those mega scalers like Apple, for example, but Meta, Google?
Yeah, I think there is a feature of that because especially Google, it's very selective on what it makes open source, and its internal products are quite often quite different from actually what the open source fragments that you're allowed to see.
Is that a strategy, trying to confuse people in some way?
I think it's just business sense. They think that
because on the layoff that they did, they get rid of aristocracy of open source. Chris DeBona, Kat Allman,
Yes.
She created Google open source of Summer of Code. So it's
Really, I didn't know that was.
oh yeah. Eric Salmon sister. So we know her here in this region for the open source programs, but.
I assume that's not the highest priority for Google at the moment. I think they think they're in a battle. They sort of are in a battle for survival with Facebook and Microsoft, and so they obviously that's presumably their dominant criteria. And they are so strong that they possibly can do most things on their own.
And this is not just trying to criticize, it's observations. They don't care about my observations, but the point is, where are we going with this?
But it's also true that industry, it's not just Google, but Facebook and Microsoft are similar, but they're rather obscure about what they make open source, and so you only get little fragments here and there, and there's no coherent open source picture. And that's, I think, for all of them, it's just the battle to survive.
Yeah.
But it's also true they're all ahead of us. So it's sort of non-trivial. That's why I consider it not quite so obvious that, let's say, academia can compete with those companies where they have, even after the layoffs, they still have orders of magnitude more people they can assign to these problems. And so it's not even obvious that it's actually possible to compete.
And that brings me to one of the topics that we've been discussing in previous days. The headline is digital twins, but it was mentioned yesterday that a good example is Google Earth or Google Maps.
Yeah.
And the virtue of that product, it's fantastic, no one will dispute that. But maybe I just want to highlight that the name of the product starts with Google.
That's right.
And that involves a number of things. If people would say Microsoft Earth or IBM Earth.
Yeah, but they do say Microsoft Windows, do they not? So all of these companies have their own creations, but most creations are probably not. Well, Microsoft is still probably dominated by its early products. Google is well dominated by the moment by search, which has got a little bit of challenge now. But all of these companies have highlighted products that are dominating their fiscal model, and then they're fighting to take over new areas.
Have you seen this before in the IT industry decades ago, that we have massive domination?
I think what's different now is that the IT industry is in the mainstream. Used to be that, I remember once discussing when Digital Equipment was a live company, we didn't compete with them because they were selling to commercial databases, and that wasn't anything. Science had no interest in that whatsoever, and there was no real competition between industry and science. Science was number one in parallel computing and areas like that, and industry was number one in commercial databases. And so now actually there's a much bigger overlap between the things that are important in research and science than what's important for industry.
And thinking about AI and deep learning, I mean, these startups that are trying to enter with new hardware, we all know that their life cycle, it's determined by a number of factors, but still, are they a threat to the Intel?
I doubt it, but I don't actually know. I think it's good to see. I mean, if you remember in parallel computing, there were hundreds of startups, and it's not so obvious, and they're probably all went under. Is that right?
But these ones are extremely well funded. I mean, Sambanova raised $5 billion?
Yeah, but also is quantum computing very well funded, and it's not so obvious there's any commercial viability in quantum computing for a long time. It's very interesting. So investors are getting quite generous about, in my opinion, about some of the areas they support. They're supporting areas which are really far out in the research space. And the AI is more obvious because at least if you really could produce a better AI engine, you would have a big market.
I couldn't finish this without asking you about ChatGPT. Is that something that we need to follow the hype, or is just something that Jan LeCun has been saying that, look, this is just a little bit of hype versus...
Yeah, well, I do think that, as I mentioned, the foundation models, to try to build a big model that is based on a lot of information and then it can be applicable to a lot of problems, I think that's a good idea.
But the cost is impressive.
Yes, well, I showed it was probably $500 million the full training cost. But as I mentioned, the inference value for language models is much higher. So whereas for science time series, I don't think the value is that big. So we'll have to see how that goes.
Thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate you coming to us, and you are always welcome.
Thank you. Great, wonderful. Although we now have the only decent weather, as far as I know, for the next 2 days, and we're stuck in here.
Well, that's also a strategy, you know.
Yeah, you are all. Well, I'm glad it didn't impact my arrival. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.